Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Scherter, and I want to welcome you to Art Talk on behalf of Mott Community College and our Fine Arts Gallery. This is a new series that we have been running this academic year due to the COVID-19 pandemic that gives us an opportunity to bring artists and educators in to talk about their work, share their insights. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Scherter, and I want to welcome you to Art Talk. There is me having a little technical fun there. Yay! The live stream coming in. But that stuff happens with us in this kind of age. So yay for that. So let me get to what we're here for today. We are bringing to you an amazing artist and educator and storyteller, Ryan Claytor. Today he's going to be talking about the nonfiction comics of Ryan Claytor. And he will discuss his nonfiction comics, his neon design and watch design, and much, much more, because Ryan is a Renaissance man. There is nothing he can't do. So let me give you a little bit of background about Ryan. Ryan is currently Michigan State University professor and coordinator of the Michigan State University Comic Art and Graphic Novel minor that they have. He holds a Master of Fine Arts, Art Multimedia from San Diego State University, a Bachelor of Arts, Art Studio from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Ryan's achievements include 5 Space, which is a small press and alternate comic expo, prizes, including the top prize, first place in the graphic novel category. His work in comics. A cartoonist in residence at the Cartoon Art Museum, visiting lectureships at the Dallas Museum of Art, the Center for Cartoon Studies, and Savannah College of Art and Design. He's had an internship with Marvel Comics and judging the Will Eisner Spirit of Comic Retailing Award. In 2009, Ryan had a featured exhibition in San Francisco's Cartoon Art Museum, and he began teaching his first comic studio course in Michigan State University's history. He will also serve as the director of the Michigan State University Comics Forum, an event for scholars, creators, and fans since 2009, and as well as hosts and producer of the MSU's Comic Art and Graphic Novel podcast from 2016 to 2020. So help me in welcoming Ryan to our talk today. If you do have any questions as we are live streaming this, please just post it right in the comment area, and I'll be monitoring that so we can ask those throughout or at the end to talk. But Ryan, thank you for being here. It is such a pleasure to have you and a great way to start off 2021.
Jim, thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to chat with you and your students. And I don't know if anybody can see Jeff behind the scenes, but Jeff, thank you for helping us out today here. This is really great. So I'm going to share my screen and see if this works. And I'm going to hope that is displaying properly. And
looks good.
I've got a few things that I'd like to chat with you about today. And we'll start off with my current job at Michigan State University, and then I'll transition into more of a traditional artist lecture, talking about my history, moving into some of my personal work, and show you some of my process. And I'd also like to talk to you about some client work that I've been doing recently, and then I'll try to open up some time for some questions, and if there are any, I'll try to provide some answers. So starting with Michigan State University, we have a number of different comic study resources at MSU, starting with the Comic Art and Graphic Novel studio courses. So we also have Comic Art and Graphic Novel minor, the podcast that Jim mentioned, the MSU Comics Forum, our Special Collections Library, and finally, a partnership between a local convention and us for comics scholarship. So let's start with those studio courses. The first of which is the Fundamentals of Comic Art and Graphic Novels. And over the course of the semester, students create several short story comics assignments. And by the end of the semester, each student has compiled those short stories into their own comic books. And at the end of the semester, typically, in the before times, we would have a professional development opportunity, which comes in the form of an in-store signing where the students sign and sell what they've made over the course of the semester. Now, in 2020 and currently, this was not the case, so we transitioned to an online event. And we also have an advanced comic art and graphic novels course where instead of creating several short stories over the course of the semester, students will create one longer length narrative and create their own books. And instead of a single in-store signing, typically students will organize an in-store signing tour across the state of Michigan, again, where they sell and sign their books. Again, this was moved online, and the students had a really great success with this just last month. In fact, one of the students organized her own Kickstarter campaign and had a $540 campaign goal, which was reached in 6 hours. And at the end of the entire campaign, she quintuple funded to over $2,500 for selling her first comic book. So I'm super, super proud of what my students are doing here. And these classes lead into the MSU Comic Art and Graphic Novel minor course of study. So this is an undergraduate minor that's housed in the art department, but it's actually an interdisciplinary minor between the art and English departments at MSU. And if you want to find out more about it, you can go to this easy to remember URL or I try to make it a little easier for you to actually remember with a tiny URL. So you can go to tinyurl.com/MSU Comics Minor, and that will take you to the same darn place at the Office of the Registrar that outlines the 5 different classes that are required for the minor. So in addition to the comic art and graphic novel minor, we also have a podcast. And this podcast consists of 3 episode segments, the first of which are regional comics announcements, comics events happening around MSU and surrounding areas in the state typically. We also have an MSU Special Collections highlight, and the core of each episode is an in-depth interview with an award-winning, professionally practicing creator. So we have many episodes banked at this point, and you can find episodes at our website, msucomics.libsyn.com, or on any podcatching app from iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Intune, etc. Wherever you go, we are there. And we've also been nominated for a podcast award in the education category by the People's Choice Podcast Awards. And here we are alongside a number of really great educational podcasts. In addition to that, we also have the MSU Comics Forum, which is a multi-day annual event for scholars, creators, and fans of comics. And we have a ton of different events associated with the forum each year. It's headlined by 2 keynote speakers. We have one award-winning comics creator, and this is lauded Canadian cartoonist Seth speaking to a packed house in the top of the library. And we also have an award-winning comics scholar that we have as our second keynote speaker, and this is Kiana Whitted from 2019. We also have an artist alley with dozens of creators behind the table of their own work. We have academic panel discussions with scholars coming from literally all over the world to discuss their research on comics. We have exhibitions of comic art from the MSU Special Collections Library, and reading discussions, film screenings, ancillary book signings, and the proverbial more. Every year we try to add more and more to this show. And as of this year, we have been running the show for 14 consecutive years. This is a slide that I am very proud of as the director of the show. I've had a lot of help making this happen, but I'm really proud that we've been able to keep it going for as long as we have. And one thing that I frequently forget to tell people is that all events associated with the forum every single year, all events are free and open to the public. So if this is something you're interested in, you are welcome to come out and experience anything associated with the forum. You don't have to be an MSU student or faculty member in order to attend. And this year, it should be a little easier for you to attend since nobody has to travel. This year's event is going to be online due to the pandemic, and you can visit our website for more information on that. That's at comicsforum.msu.edu. We also have the MSU Special Collections Library, which, if you haven't heard, is this nondescript glassed-in reading room on the first floor of the MSU main library. As soon as you walk in the door, you'll see this. And there's not a lot of talk about what this is, but below this floor sits the largest public collection of comic books in the world. I'm going to let you sit with that for just a minute. I am flabbergasted every time I think about it. So at Michigan State University, we have the largest public collection of comic books anywhere, ever, at over 350,000 entries and counting. Almost anything you can conceive of is there. You want to look at Wonder Woman #1, we have it. You want to look at Walt Disney Comics and Stories #1, we have it. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention a particular person named Randy Scott, who is this lovely individual here who has made it his life's work to amass the world's largest public collection of comic books. So, Randy, I don't know if you're watching, but thank you for giving us this huge hook to hang our hats on. Everyone associated with comic studies at MSU and beyond, thanks you for your life work. And finally, I wanted to mention this partnership that we have in conjunction with the Capital City Comic Con. This is a local Lansing comic convention, and together we've partnered to form a scholarship, comic studies, that is only open to MSU comic studies students. So this is not a nationwide scholarship. This is not a statewide or even university-wide scholarship or even a departmental-wide scholarship. This is a very narrow pool of applicants, which are Michigan State University comic studies students. And the scholarship recipient is their artwork is used to promote the event in a number of different venues, from their website, which you can see here. They also use it in a number of publications. This is a write-up that we did on Christy Hans, one of our scholarship recipients, that appeared in the City Pulse, which is a local arts magazine with a circulation of 30,000 copies. And it came with this giant fold-out printing of her artwork. We also use it on the program book for the convention, and the scholarship recipient receives a free table to exhibit and sell their work. And if that wasn't enough, they also receive $1,000 cold hard cash in their pocket that is not tied to anything. It's not tied to tuition or room and board or books. This is $1,000 for the recipient to have and to hold and do with what they please. We hope that you make comics with it, but we don't check up on you. So that is what I wanted to mention as far as the number of different resources we have at Michigan State University for comic studies. And if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to chat about that at the end of my talk. So at this point, I make the seamless transition from talking about my current work life to my history and growing up. So Jim, if you don't mind, strumming the chimes for me and making the screen a little wobbly, we're going to take a trip back in time here for a moment to 1979, when I was born. And I was raised in a very tiny town in California called Santa Ynez. And I remember drawing ever since I have memories. I was drawing on everything, on paper, on fabric. And one day I started drawing on fabric, and my mom took this and made a pillow out of it. And this happened a lot because we had a lot of pillows with my drawings on them. So Mom, if you're watching, thank you for encouraging me in the arts. Here I am still doing it 41 years later. So as you can tell from this picture, I was always the portrait of masculinity, from my drawings of Care Bears and rainbows and big fish and who knows what in the world that is. I still don't know. But thankfully, my drawing started to improve as time progressed. Here's a drawing of Mickey Mouse I did a couple of years later. And as you can see, I was interested in Disney folks. And this was kind of my gateway into comics as I started reading Walt Disney comics and stories. But as I read through these, I really started gravitating more toward the Duck stories like Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge, because, Mickey Mouse stories, it seemed like everything always went his way. Like he was just happy-go-lucky no matter what. But Donald Duck felt a little more relatable to me because things didn't quite go as he wanted, and he'd lose his temper, and who doesn't want a bin of money to swim around in? So I was reading a lot of Duck books at the time. But as I continued to age, my tastes, I would like to think, started to refine a little bit, and I started getting interested in satire. And one of the books that really led me toward this was Sergio Aragonés' Gru the Wanderer. And Sergio Aragonés has been drawing for Mad Magazine for over 50 years now. And if you're not familiar with Gru the Wanderer, it's sort of a Conan the Barbarian spoof. It's about this guy who is very good with his swords, but very dumb in the head, which makes for a very dangerous combination. So he loves his dog, and he loves cheese dip even more. And when you open up these books, you are greeted with this double-page spread of this incredible world-building experience. Even every issue has this. So, I'd like to just zoom in here on a couple things to show you, you can see life being lived in these covered wagon communities. And, you start scrolling around the page and you can see what looks like a water wheel, but it's up in the mountains. So there's no rushing water here. So how do you turn the mill without water? Well, you build it into a ladder and you have a bunch of people climb up one side of it, and that turns the mill. So this is really an early influence for me and my work, and really starting to get me to think about world building. And comics are really a big part of my life growing up through, I would say, junior high. In fact, here in junior high, I'm still writing reports about comics and, using this to put myself through elementary school. But shortly thereafter, as I entered high school, I entered this dark decade of no comics in my life. As I got to high school, I was focused more on being cool, probably unsuccessfully, and impressing the opposite sex. And comics did not further either of those goals in my mind. So I kind of forgot about comics for a while. And even into undergrad, I was not thinking about comics, but I was having some formative experiences. So I went to undergrad at UC Santa Barbara. Yes, it's really right on the coastline, which did me no good because I do not surf. But I took this really great class from a professor named Kip Fulbeck called Personal Narrative. And if you're not familiar with Kip Fulbeck, he's really fantastic artist, but also a writer. He's written a book called Paper Bullets, a fictional autobiography, and also a book called Part Asian, 100% Hapa, which is a book of portraiture of mixed race Asian folks. And each spread has a portrait that is paired with a page of handwritten response to a question that they receive all the time, which is, what are you? And the answers range from hilarious to heartbreaking and everything in between. If you haven't picked up this book, I would highly recommend it. But this class on the personal narrative was really the first time I was made aware of the fact that you could use personal experiences as content for art making. So it was around the end of my undergraduate career, and I was lucky enough to be one of the few students my last year of college who had a car. And I had a buddy at the time whose name was Marty, and he asked me if I would take him to the comic book store. And I said, "Oh, yes, of course. I'd love to do that." And off we went to go to the comic book store. And when we got there, I wasn't thinking much of it, but my eyes were open to this whole new world that had unfolded in the last decade since I was interested in comics. I ended up picking up a book by my old favorite artist, Sergio Aragonés, who you probably recall is the same one to do Gru the Wanderer. And after reading this book, the floodgates opened. I just started reading more and more and more books and educating myself on what had been happening in the past decade. And again, I was at the end of my undergraduate career at this point, and having done a degree in art studio. And so it was sort of a natural progression of my interest in comics to start trying out my own hand and trying to teach myself this medium of comics. So it was around a year or so after undergrad where I was heavily into comics again, and I managed to get myself an internship at Marvel Comics in New York City. So I was a production intern and ended up filtering around all sorts of different departments, from the bullpen, learning industry technical standards, to working with Dave Sharp, who was the last in-house letterer, and even filtering around to editorial, manufacturing, and sitting in on print and production meetings, just really learning a lot about comics and the comics industry. But even after this internship, I still had not created any of my own work. And after I came back from that internship at Marvel Comics, I went to the Alternative Press Expo in San Francisco. Now, this convention, this comic convention, is only for independent publishers on demand. So mainstream publishers are restricted from exhibiting here. So no Marvel, no DC, no Dark Horse, no Image. Independent presses down to high school kids who photocopied their books the night before, and everyone in between. And needless to say, there was a wide diversity of material here and just super inspiring. And so after I attended this show, I said, that's it. I've got to create my own work. And I was very interested in nonfiction work at the time, historical fiction, autobiography. And this is the segue into when I started creating comics. So I formed a self-publishing company called Elephant Eater Comics, which is kind of a funny name. And people will frequently ask me, what does that even mean? And it's actually a saying that my dad used to tell me and my siblings when we were young. He says, well, it's like eating an elephant. You just do it one bite at a time, and before you know it, you're done. So this piece of advice has served my family well, and it served me well. When I have big tasks in front of me, like creating books or going through school, and just kind of keeps me grounded and was a way for me to pay tribute to my dad too. So these are the first 4 books that I created in my autobiographical comic book series called And Then One Day. And each of these books were hand printed, hand folded, hand stapled, hand assembled by me and also my mom. Thanks, Mom. And I did these in runs of anywhere from 200 copies to 800 copies a piece. And to my size, when I sold out of these, people wanted more. And so I collected these first 4 issues into this single volume. And I thought I would read the introduction to this book to you because I think it serves as a nice artist statement from where my work was at the time. So in this first tier that you see here, there's a series of simultaneously successive panels, which is a fancy way of saying there's a single background throughout, but a repeated character to show a passage of time. And as I approach the camera, this is me with a little more hair. I say, hello again, or maybe for the first time. I'm the guy creating these comics, Ryan, if we haven't met before. This book contains all the strips from the first 4 issues of my autobiographical comic book series, And Then One Day. I know, autobio comics. You've seen them, right? Well, I think with these, you'll find a little different spin on the daily strip. It's not quite so morose, so riddled with angst and defeatism, which, if you haven't read any autobiographical comics, A lot of them are. Not to say the proverbial poop doesn't hit my fan now and again, but the strips in here have a focus on living life and recognize details that make our existence worthwhile, regardless of whether the situation was exhilarating, heartbreaking, or simply quotidian. A lot of these sequences are probably often overlooked in each of our lives, but on closer examination, I think they are what provide the intonation, inflection, and subtleties that make our lives rich. I'm not trying to say these experiences of mine are any more worthy of publication than yours or anyone else's. I'm just an average, quirky guy. But I hope from experiencing this book, it will inspire you to look at your own life with a critical and observant eye, while still being thankful for what it is. I know it did that for me. So this is an example of one of the pages in that book, and it says, every time I wake up, it seems I immediately wrench myself out of bed and go to work. Today I woke up to the still silence of the morning sun and pondered the fleeting tranquility of this moment, then went to work. So you can see how I was really focused on panelization at this time and trying to think about how that can contribute to the content of the work itself. So I developed this democratic grid structure where every panel occupies the same amount of space, developing this very regular cadence and rhythm until that third tier, when we have this elongated panel. It's 3 times as long as any other panel on the page, which really encourages you to sit with this panel a little longer. And on top of that, the text there is set on this curvilinear baseline, which also encourages you to linger a little more and slow things down. And then, boom, right back to that democratic grid structure for the final panel. And this may come as a surprise, but I super hate reading comics out loud. So I'm just going to let everybody read this one. So these strips were really kind of like a diary in comic form. You could see that some were kind of humorous or contemplative or somber. It just really depended upon what happened that particular day. Now, parallel to my life in comics is my life in teaching. And around this time, I was teaching at a local community college in California, Santa Barbara Community College. And a full-time position came up, and I was really excited about this. This is what I wanted to do in my life. And so I applied, and I made it through all rounds of interviews and got second place to a gal who had a master's degree. And so at that point, I knew if I wanted to teach full-time at college level, I needed my terminal degree. So I applied to a number of schools and got a number of acceptances and ended up choosing to go to school at San Diego State University at their MFA program. Now, when I got accepted, I thought to myself, a Masters of Fine Art program is probably not going to be very accepting of comics in their program. So let's set this comics thing aside for a little bit and just focus on the work for the MFA. But at the same time, I didn't want to completely give up this practice that I've been working on for a few years now. So I put myself on an exercise where I'd bring a sketchbook with me wherever I went, and I would draw a single image accompanied by some text. It was not comics exactly. It was more of an illustrated journal, but it was something to keep my hand moving and keep up this practice. And I took this with me everywhere, from coffee shops to mechanics, and yes, even in my graduate school classrooms. And inevitably, the teachers would look over my shoulder and say, "What are you working on there?" And I said, "Oh, it's this comics thing that I do." And I said, "Well, why aren't you doing that in graduate school?" And I said, "I don't know, because I'm an idiot. I don't know, because I applied to grad school with comics in my portfolio. So why I had this notion, I don't know." But at that point, it was like permission was given to me to pursue my interest. And so I took these pages and turned them into my next book, which was And Then One Day number 5. Again, it wasn't comics, but it was still the same subject matter. It was still autobiographical in nature. And this led to my following book, And Then One Day number 6, which was a part of my graduate studies. In fact, I had been doing a lot of reading on autobiography, finding different theories, and I read about one that says that autobiography is no more truthful or valid than fiction, which got me thinking, well, what could I do as a practitioner to make autobiography any more truthful or objective than it already is? So I came up with this method of interviewing a lot of different people in my life, everyone from longtime friends to new acquaintances since moving to grad school, parents, teachers, and yes, even girlfriends. And instead of interviewing them face to face, because I didn't want to influence their responses, I made these questions in the form of a box of flashcards and put each person in an isolated room with only that box of questions and a tape recorder and let them have at it. So I transcribed these interviews and converted them into comic book form, and they ended up looking something like this. Now, this is a longtime friend of mine named Rhett, and before this project, Rhett never said any of this to me. So he says, when Ryan first started doing cartoons, I was like, Jesus Christ, you got to be kidding me. Didn't you grow out of that crap when you were 12 years old, like the rest of us? But now that I have his books, I definitely do look at it more as an art form. I mean, because it's telling his life story through art and words. So I think I definitely have more respect for it now than when I first saw it. This was actually really gratifying for me to hear, because halfway through this page, you see this grassroots mind shift happen in somebody that had very little, if any, respect for this medium that was so important to me. But then after experiencing some of the work that I was doing, has this new outlook. So I was actually really happy to hear this. But it was also interesting to hear how different people were affected in different ways and would respond in different ways to this project. This is my dad. He's a little older than the average bear. I am child number 7 of 7. And he says, I think Ryan is going to be a much greater influence on people and the world around him than he has any idea about at this time. When he gets to the end of his life, he will be absolutely amazed at the people he's influenced that he didn't even think about influencing, and the things that he might have said have influenced people in such a way that he had no idea he was doing, some of them negative and some of them positive. So, I've got my headphones in, I'm transcribing these interviews, and I'm listening to my dad. My son is going to be influential. My son is great. My son is good. I'm thinking to myself, this is so boring. This is never going in the book. But then at the end, it's sort of a wake-up call to think about how we interact with people. He says some of these experiences you have are going to be negative, some are going to be positive. And so to me, it felt like a reminder to be mindful of how we interact with everybody in our daily lives. And so I'm super grateful for my dad. It was also really interesting to see how people would respond very differently to the same question in this interview. So this is a friend of mine named David who says, Ryan's favorite color, I'd have to go with like a navy blue. He seems really even-keeled, but light and humorous, just kind of calming, I guess. Which is in high contrast to Shayna, an ex-girlfriend, who says, I suppose that Ryan's favorite color is blue. I suppose this because it is a fairly standard color to be a favorite color, and Ryan does not strike me as being a very think outside the box kind of guy. It's a very lovely color, the color of the sky, the color of the ocean, the color of all things great and good, and strikes me as a very Claytor-esque sort of thing to enjoy. So you can see how this was really a hybrid of autobiography and documentary all melded together. And after this project, I still had a lot of questions about autobiography and how it related to comics. And so I set myself up on this independent studies with an advising professor of mine at the time named Harry Polkenhorn, and recorded a conversation between us about this very subject. And that was the basis for my next 3 books over the next 3 years. The first 16 pages were completed in grad school, and then I moved on, but I continued the project for multiple years after I was done with grad school. So in this project, it allowed me to visualize some of these ideas and theories I was contemplating, because I don't know about anybody watching, but I am a very visually oriented person. I learn best visually. And so you can see that at work in some of these pages. So I was mentioning this theory that I just told you about a few moments ago. And I say, so really, I guess you could say autobiography is just a big continuum ranging from truth to fiction. And there's never any absolute. I don't think autobio will ever sit on either extreme of the spectrum. It's never pure truth. And on the other hand, it's never pure fiction. And so you can see some of these panels where I'm working this out in my mind and trying to make some of these ideas more visual. Another interest of mine with this project was really imbuing this with a level of authenticity, and to the point where I was even including these idiosyncratic ums and pauses and speech patterns that you can see here. And after the top tier of dialogue is over and I'm waiting for a response, in the second tier, I look across the table, and when none is given, my eyes sort of move around and find the burrito, and I start eating that. And then we pan over to the other side of the table where the professor is finishing up a bite of his own and then releases with his thoughts on the subject. And this happens a number of different times, as you can see here. Another thing I was focused on in this particular work is environments. Now, every new book that I create, I try to identify area of my where I need work as an artist. And I wasn't really doing a lot of environments before this. So I challenged myself to, one, make more environments in this particular book so that I could get better technically. But the other reason I included environments in this book is because this is a weird little comic. This is a comic book about autobiographical theory as it relates to comics. This is not something you walk into your local comic shop and decide to pick up. This is a happenstance find. So I wanted the environments to speak to this in a way that you can see, okay, they're walking around a university environment because of things like these weird public art pieces that you typically see at universities, or quintessentially an admin building at a university, and even those vertical banners that are on every university lamppost of them touting their greatness. This speaks university in its visuals. So after this series was done, I had always conceived of it as a single collected edition. So when it was finished, I started duoing these pages, which is basically coloring with only 2 colors, to add highlighting and depth of field to each of these pages, and then ended up doing a crowdfunding campaign to fund the printing of this next book. So those 3 books put together are Autobiographical Conversations, which came out in 2013. So another thing that changed my life forever for the best in this particular year is the fact that I became a father. And in fact, I became a father in the dead center of my crowdfunding campaign to make this book, which was a silly decision in retrospect, but it all worked out for the best. But this little dude, who is not so little anymore, affected my life and my work as well. I started making comics about fatherhood, and this is one of them. It was sort of harkening back to some of my earlier work of single-page autobiographical comic strips. And in here, I say, "Hey, honey, look at all that snow." And we look outside. I'm a Californian, so snow is still exciting to me. And as we look out the window, he says, I look down and respond, We look outside again. And he continues the conversation. So another thing that was happening in my life around this time is that my interest in pinball was getting reignited. This is my son and I at the Chicago Pinball Expo playing a game in, I think this looks like it might be around 2014. And pinball re-entered my life in a big and uncontrollable way, to the point where it altered my artistic path as well. In fact, this is my most recent book. It's called Coin-Op Carnival, and it's about electromechanical coin-operated amusement devices, which put in plain English means old pinball and arcade games that were manufactured prior to 1978, prior to the advent of printed circuit boards, like computers operating things. And I illustrated everything in this book, and I co-wrote it with my very good friend and technical genius, Nick Baldridge. This is the two of us at our book launch at the Texas Pinball Festival, the largest pinball expo in North America. And inside this book, we have everything from an interview with the most prolific pinball designer of all times. His name is Wayne Nyans. He was 100 years old when we published this book, and he just turned 102 not long ago, and he is still living on his own at 102. Just an absolutely remarkable man who I feel privileged to have become friendly with. We also have game reviews like you see on the Space Pilot spread there, as well as electromechanical technical segments. And we have full-blown comics like the introduction on the left, and there is a multi-page story from Wayne about his life. And over the course of 2019, we toured 16 different stops in 10 different states, letting people know about this new book of ours. And in 2020, people started taking notice. We received, as Jim mentioned at the start of my talk, the highest honor at the Small Press and Alternative Comics Expo Space Prize Awards, first place in the graphic novel category. And we also received a couple of other industry award nominations as well. Another thing that I've done as a creator, and I'll wrap up this creator talk in a moment here, is I've done a few tours, like I mentioned for Coin-Op Carnival, but in 2007, I embarked on the largest ever self-published comic book tour that has ever been done, to 50 different states and 50 different stops in 18 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So what you are looking at right here is my summer in between years of grad school. So after I finished up with grad school, in my final year, I met this really great girl who I am now married to, and she got this wonderful gig at Michigan State University and got me a bit of a partner hire while she was at it. So instead of just driving across the country, I thought, why not make a tour out of it? So I did another tour in 2008, as well as 2010 and 11. And after all this touring, I have now visited over 100 comic book stores in the nation and all 48 contiguous states. So I mention all this not to toot my own horn, but to say if anybody in the audience has any questions about comics or making comics or the industry, I might have an answer for you. And if I don't, then I probably know somebody who does. So if there's anything you're interested in, please stick around for the Q&A at the end. Okay. But this is leading us into me pulling back the curtain on creating comics. I'm kind of a process junkie. I love seeing how people do what they do. And so I thought I would show you how I make comics. This is not to say this is how to make comics, because everybody makes things in different ways, but this is how I go about making comics. And typically it starts with a very sparse script. I will typically type this out in a word processing program because I can type a whole lot faster than I can write. And this allows me to get my ideas out a lot quicker. And the reason this is so sparse is because I'm pretty much the only one looking at it at this stage. So there's no call outs for panel numbers or characters or anything like that. But this allows me to take this dialogue and copy paste it into a vector art program like Adobe Illustrator. So I have page spreads set up, templates that I can use, and then I'll carriage return these words and put them into speech balloons. And all of that stuff over on the left-hand side, that mess of bars you see, are basically gutters, the space between panels. And I can easily pull over an equally spaced two-panel tier or two-tier set of panels, or 3 tiers or 4 or 5, and lay out a page with relative quickness. And once I'm done, it looks something like this. And I will pull in this image to another program called Clip Studio Pro, which is kind of like Photoshop, but it's really geared directly toward comic book artists. So at this point, I digitally pencil my work. And if you look a little closer here, you can see organized over in the layers palette on the right-hand side, I'll give each panel their own folder, and within that folder I'll do my best to isolate each element. Like you can see there's a man layer and a background layer and a Ryan layer and a couple other layers there that I was a naughty boy and I didn't label. I think those are the balloon tails, but it allows me to individually edit each of those separate items. So I can move the Ryan character separately from the background, separately from the man, resize them, etc. So I can get this laid out exactly as I need it before I will turn this to Blue Line and print it out on Bristol on a large format printer. Now, this whole Blue Line thing strikes people as sort of mysterious, but essentially what this is non-photo reproductive blue. And what that means is all of this stuff is going to be inked over. These are just the messy pencils right now, but then once the artist, me in this case, sees the pencils, then I can ink over with a really confident line. Okay, so once I scan those in, the blue line essentially disappears. Okay, so once I print that out, I'll do some sparse analog pencils because I can't get all the detail that I need on my screen. And then I start inking, usually with the text first, just because it's pretty mindless and I need somewhere to start. And then I'll continue inking the rest of the page. And once that's inked, I'll show you that in a second, but here's a slide of the tools that I use. I'll frequently get asked about what tools I use, and I have an 0.5 millimeter mechanical pencil that you see at the top there with the blue lead. I also have a Faber-Castell brush pen, some fixed width pens, and then finally that white jelly roll marker for correcting mistakes. And you'll see that all of these are tools that you can pop a cap on and leave, because yes, there are better tools to make comics, there are more expensive tools to make comics, but the way my life is with being a professor and being a daddy and being a husband, I have very little time to create, and so I have to be able to start and end at a moment's notice. So these are my tools of choice. And this is what a page looks like when it's done being inked. And I'll take this everywhere with me in the before times when I would actually leave my house. And people would ask me, wow, that's really clean. How do you ink this and not make any mistakes? And the truth of the matter is there are plenty of mistakes on this page. In fact, if you look closely at the side of the page, you can see all the notes that I take. I need to adjust these eyes, move this arm a little bit. And these are all around the page so that when I scan in this page, then I can remember to make those adjustments once the page is scanned in a digital form. So here's the page once it's threshold. All those blue pencil marks are magicked away and all the corrections have been made. And this next portion is the one spot in my process where I have relinquished a little bit of control. So when it comes time to color, there is a process called flatting. And basically, every piece of color needs to be outlined with a marquee tool in Photoshop. The green leaves of the tree need to be outlined, and the brown branch and the dark road and the brown hair and the flesh-colored flesh. All of that needs to be individually outlined and have a color laid down there, which takes a considerable amount of time. So I've started hiring out the flatting process, which you see here. But then once the flatting is complete, the flatter will send that back to the colorist, which in this case is me, and I will convert that to the colors that I want them to be and do that 24 more times, and then you have a book. So that's kind of my process that I go through to make comics. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is some of my client work. Now, this is not something that I hear artists talking about a lot, but I think it's something that's pretty important as an artist, as a working artist. So I wanted to bring this up and kind of mention a word of advice at the end of the talk before I let loose with some Q&A. So my client work these days has kind of been in three different veins. One is pinball, and another is neon design, and another is watch design. So let's start out with pinball design. So as I mentioned, about a decade ago, I really fell back in love with pinball. This is the first pinball machine that I ever purchased. I have a few now. And at the time, I was really exploring this newfound fascination, going to different pinball shows. Yes, there are pinball shows. Yes, they exist in Michigan. And I was at a great one called Pinball at the Zoo, which is not at an animal sanctuary, which would be amazing. It's actually located in the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan, ergo Pinball at the Zoo. And I was there for my first time and just having a ball, and went up to their merch table and was really excited to, get a t-shirt and support this show. And I walk up to the merch table, and my inner horrible person, graphic designer mind starts looking at this table and thinking, oh man, everything is just a black shirt and boring and standard fonts and clip art. I can't. And so I went up to the owner and I introduced myself. I said, hey, I'm Ryan. I'm a comics artist. I'd love to make a design for you guys next year. Is there any chance you're interested in working with me? And he said, yeah, let's talk. What do you want to do? And I said, I don't know. I like robots. You want some robots? He's like, yep, make some robots. So this is the image that I made for their next event artwork. And this event artwork was put on t-shirts, as well as limited edition screen printed prints that they made, and their event artwork that they posted all over town. And this was really well received. In fact, we printed 150 t-shirts, which sold out. We printed another 50. We sold out of those. So we sold through 200 t-shirts. We printed 50 copies of that limited edition a screen printed artwork, sold through of those. And so at that point, the owner said, well, let's do this some more. So I made the next couple years of Pinball at the Zoo artwork. So I've got this nice trilogy of artwork. But after I produced that first green robot image, people in pinball started taking notice, not just in Michigan, but around the country. And people started coming to me and saying, hey, I want you to make some pinball artwork for me. And I was very excited because when somebody says, I want you to draw a pinball machine, I'm psyched. So the next person that came up to me was a guy named Rob Anthony, and he has a business where he travels around the country to different pinball shows doing circuit board repair. He's one of the only people who do this in the country, this pinball circuit board repair stuff. And he does this in his red Honda Fit with his trusty dog, Taro, traveling the country. So we came up with this image together that we're both super proud of. And this whole pinball artwork thing has allowed me to meet a number of different people. In fact, some of which you might even recognize, like NBA player Todd McCulloch. So Todd McCulloch has played for the Philadelphia 76ers as well as the New Jersey Nets. And in addition to being a great basketball player, he's also a really great pinball player and a super nice guy. In fact, I was off at a pinball show. I believe it was the 2014 Pinball Expo. And just as a reminder, when I'm going around these pinball shows, I am not cool guy. I am dad guy. I have my diaper bag around me and my son strapped to my chest. And as I'm sitting here watching the reveal of a new pinball machine, I'm, sitting here bouncing my son, and all of a sudden this looming presence comes over me. This 6'3" giant says, "Are you Ryan Claytor?" And I look up. You literally look up like you're looking at a skyscraper when you're talking to Todd McCulloch. And I say, "Yes, are you Todd McCulloch?" And he proceeds to have a really nice conversation with me about my work. He says, "I love what you do." And he starts naming individual things like, "I love your pinball at the zoo robots that you did. That image for Rob Anthony was really amazing." He obviously wasn't blowing smoke. He was genuine. And he ended the conversation by saying, "I've got a home arcade and I would love for you to do some work for me." And, of course, yeah, let's talk. So together, Todd and I came up with this image. So Todd, it has a lot of interests that we tried to fit all of them into this one image. He's a basketball player, of course. He's also Canadian, which you see on his jersey. He's also really into Slurpees, which you see in his hand there, and pinball, of course. And if you look closely at those pinball machines, those back glasses have the name of his wife and children. So all of his family are represented on there because this is his home arcade. And finally, that bumper car is a representation of a wonderfully weird little game called Whirly Ball. For the sake of time, I'm not going to explain it. Look it up, but just imagine 6'3" Todd McCulloch. I'm sorry, 7'3" Todd McCulloch jammed in a bumper car, and there are few things that make me happier to think about in life. So, Todd, thank you for commissioning me to do this. Love you, man. And I've also done some work for pinball manufacturers. In fact, there's a pinball manufacturer called Multimorphic, and they produce a pinball machine platform called the P3 platform, which is the most revolutionary pinball design that has ever been created in the history of man. And I feel very confident saying that. Instead of a piece of plywood that the ball rolls across, that first portion of the playfield is a dynamically updating LCD television screen. So your ball can actually interact with virtual elements, in addition to having flippers and slingshots and targets over top of that television screen as well. And then that back portion that you see moving up and down is a modular portion of the playfield. So you can actually insert different games, different physical targets in the same cabinet. It's kind of like, an old Nintendo Entertainment System. You swap in different games in the same cabinet, right? So instead of having a room full of 12 pinball machines, now you can have one machine with 12 swappable playfields and occupying a lot smaller footprint. So, needless to say, this is a really innovative and amazing product. And it was a really interesting task to sort of distill this information down into a single graphic. But that's exactly what company owner Jerry Stellenberg and I set out to do. So this is an image that was printed on T-shirts for the company, the Revolutionary P3, and we have, ultimate playfield modularity, this motion sensing LCD playfield, and groundbreaking gameplay features. So we've got this like 3 bullet point effect in visual form, and this is worn by all company members at all shows. It's really fun to see this out at shows. So on the left, the guy that looks like me without glasses is Jerry Stellenberg, the company owner, and myself and co-writer and good friend Nick Baldridge, all wearing those P3 shirts. And I've also worked for a few other manufacturers like Stern Pinball, who is the largest pinball manufacturer in the world. I met their director of marketing at the time at a comic convention, and we started up a conversation. And so I had this idea for a T-shirt for a long time, but it was very ambitious, and at the end of the day would be very costly to produce. Basically, it would require multiple location prints with multiple colors. But I figured, if anybody's going to bite on this idea, it's going to be the largest pinball manufacturer in the world. So I said, hey, I've got this idea for essentially a comic book t-shirt. So if you look at this shirt, this is a Day of the Dead theme. And it starts on the back where these skeletons are crawling out of the ground. They're enjoying this pinball machine, and they say, where do we get more? We want to find more of this pinball stuff. And one of them says, the guy went this way. So she's pointing off to the left-hand side, which leads you to the left sleeve print. So you see the skeletons continuing to walk forward, and I think I see him. There he is. And then the t-shirt rotates again to the front of the t-shirt, where you see this thinly veiled advertisement for Stern Pinball, and the skeletons are chasing company figurehead Gary Stern across the t-shirt, and he is leading your eye toward the right-hand sleeve, where you see the three designers of Stern Pinball at the time all pleading for Gary not to bring these skeletons their way. So I guess I didn't screw this one up too badly, because Stern asked me back to create their 30th anniversary logo, which were also printed on a number of t-shirts. And I've also done work for a number of other pinball entities, like the largest pinball championships in the world and the largest pinball website in the world. There are others, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to Neon Design, which all started with my good buddy Pete, who you see on the right-hand side here. So Pete, a good friend of mine through pinball, and he's a few years older than I am. I like to remind him of that. And when he turned 40, his wife gave me a call and said, hey, I want to make something special for his 40th, and I want to create a custom neon sign for our game room. Can you help me out with this? And I said, of course. And before this time, I had no idea that custom neon artwork was even a thing that could happen in this world. And so, I worked with his wife, Julie, on this, and I think it turned out all right. And he now has this hanging in his game room, and I'll try to focus on the neon itself here for a moment. Pete is really into wolves and obviously into pinball, and so we came up with this design and had it fabricated in neon. So that happened for Pete's 40th. And basically, for the next 5 years, every time I went over to Pete's house, I would covet this sign. I don't know if you've ever stood in front of a neon sign before, but they are so captivating. It's hard to represent in a photograph, but I was just so enamored with this sign. And 5 years later, when my 40th rolled around, my wife and parents said, we know you really want this, and we'd like to help you get this if you want to design it. So I ended up designing my own neon sign. It was a little bigger. It was 8 feet wide, and it was also animated. And this holds a place of pride in my game room, which was recently renovated, and it's just an absolute centerpiece. I love this thing. Sometimes I'll go down there and just turn it on and not even play any pinball, just admire the glow. But what I want to mention about this is when I was designing this sign, I was doing multiple iterations because I knew I had one shot at this thing, and this was going to sit in my game room forever. So I was uploading my process work in different designs and on a pinball message board that I'm a part of. And out of the blue, somebody who was following this thread emailed me even before my sign was done and said, I want you to do that for me. And so that led to me meeting a fellow named Mike Queen, and he commissioned me to do a Queen's Arcade neon sign for him, which now hangs in his pole barn arcade. And here's a close-up of that sign, of the amazing fabrication work that's done by Josh Goodacre, who you see on the right-hand side here. So that's me on the left and Josh on the right with another one of our signs for Dennis Kriesel, who is really interested in 1950s, mid-century retro atomic artwork. And so I created this atomic rocket ship for him, which is also animated with an animated rocket blast and twinkling stars. And we've also done some signs for businesses. In fact, if you happen to drive over to Sunfield, Michigan, which is about 40 minutes west, 30 minutes west of Lansing, you'll see this double-sided flag sign hanging outside of the Sunfield Historical Society that I designed and Josh created. And finally, I want to show you what is probably the most complex neon design puzzle that Josh and I have ever attempted. So we got a call from an arcade collector in Dallas, Texas, who obviously is a big Godzilla fan. And, I came up with a few ideas, and I really wanted to do this building blast, but I didn't think that it was possible because when you're designing neon, lit tubes cannot cross each other. And so each of these have to be separated from one another. These tubes cannot cross, sort of like in Ghostbusters. Don't cross the beams, man. So if that happens, then it illuminates an erroneous tube that you don't want to see on these different alternating parts of animation. So all that to say, I spent a long time trying to figure out how this might work and managed to get it to work. And again, this was costly, but to the credit of the commissioner, every new thing we came up with, they said, yes, this looks amazing, do it. And when I first proposed this, it was just sort of a generic backdrop of buildings. But as I mentioned, the commissioner lives in Dallas, Texas. And he said, I really love Godzilla, but I also love my town. And I want to do an homage to it by having Godzilla destroy Dallas. So he sent me a couple images of the Dallas skyline, which I worked into the final product. And I just want to show you a couple of unlit images so you can see the amount of glass that is crammed into a single area in order to make this animation happen. It was just an absolute puzzle to figure out, but Josh and I are both very proud of how this turned out. And finally, I want to talk to you about another client work that I've been doing recently, which is watch design. And, this all started when I got a watch bought for me by my mother. We were on a vacation together, and she saw me eyeing this thing and bought it for me. And, I didn't think much about watches for a long time. This was my only one. And, in COVID times, we've had a little more time to contemplate things and find welcome distractions, and watch collecting was one of them for me. So I ended up buying another watch that I fancied, which led to more and more watches. And in the course of me researching watches, they're really interesting. It's almost like pinball in a sense that, there's mechanics involved with it, but there's also a lot of artistry involved with it. And I found this company that was based in London called Mr. Jones Watches, and they produce a line of artist designed watches. And I would comb their website, just absolutely enamored by what they do. And eventually one day I reached out to the company and introduced myself, and ended the letter by saying, I'm a comics artist and a university professor, and I'd love to work with you. So to my surprise, I heard back from the company owner, who said, we'd love to work with you too. And so what are your ideas? So I sent them a few ideas, and this was one of them. But this was too poopy to show anybody. So I refined this a little bit and sent them this image. Basically, I had an idea for like old time midway, like shooting gallery, where the targets would tell the time. And just to sort of exemplify how this would work, I also turned this into an animated GIF so they could understand what I was thinking for this. The slower moving targets are the hour and the faster moving targets are the minutes, obviously. So this design progressed and had a whole lot of illustrated parts associated with it. We worked together and they sent me different prototypes and I would send them back Pantone color chips of what I hoped to see in the watch. And ultimately, we together designed this watch, of which I am extraordinarily proud. So this was one of the highlights of my 2020. And I know there are not many for many people, but this was one of the bright spots in mine. This watch was released in August of 2020 and sold out in record time. This sold out in less than 2 hours, which was the fastest anything had sold out in Mr. Jones Watch's company history. So they've even let me, decorate not only the face of the watch, but even the case back, a custom engraved illustrated case back. And I mention all this client work because I was trying to think about this talk and who the audience was. I'm guessing predominantly to Mott Community College students. And I was thinking to myself, if I could cut my life in half and go back to when I was 18 to 22 years old and give myself some advice, what would it be? And there was a lot, but one thing I would tell myself is go after the type of artwork that you want to do. Now, I did a lot of work fresh out of college that was just work to get work. This ranged from, cell phone advertisements to, drawing books for restaurants and just a bunch of stuff that I didn't care about and really did not contribute to what I consider my body of work. And it took me a while in a number of different stages of my life, from graduate school where I was afraid to make comics, that they wouldn't fit in with a graduate program, to, after school and getting client work and just taking anything I possibly could. But ultimately, whatever work that you do begets more of that work. Like when I created this green robot pinball at the zoo image, that started snowballing and giving me more pinball work. This neon sign that I did for myself started snowballing and giving me a ton more neon work. Likewise for the watch design. So, understand we're getting out of school. There is an element of, I need to make some money. I need to take what I can get. But by that same token, I would also urge you to look heavily in your areas of interest, because that is going to beget more work that you want to do. So that's going to do it for my talk, and I'll end it there and see if there are any questions from the audience. So thank you again, Jim, for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Ryan, thank you, because I secretly, it's not even a secret, I follow you on Facebook, right? So I see all these things and I'm like, man, you are so amazing. I mean, and I mean that. I 100% mean it. And hearing your story more fully, because you've taught for us at Mott before in the past, I was amazed at the comic class that you did. You were teaching for us and U of M Flint at the same time. I remember you doing a one of your forum or one of the sale events down at Vault of Midnight down in Ann Arbor, and just impressed with your dedication to all of it. So having you see more about you, like getting that backstory that I don't know, right? From just being a voyeur of your Facebook page, right? I love this. So this is amazing. And wow, I just like huge kudos to you for all the success that you are having right now. So we do have a question that just came in. And this is about what, your pinball collection, which also you have like started me looking at pinball machines too. I'm like,
yes,
I would like a pinball machine. But what draws you to that? What kind of got you? What made that connection? What made you interested in pinball?
Oh gosh, I'm sure there's an element of nostalgia built in for me. When I was a kid, my dad had a pinball machine or two in our basement, and I remember playing those was very young. And, similar to comics, I thought about them for a long time, maybe 20 years or so. And when I moved to Michigan, I was trying to get to know the area and looking around and found Pinball Pete's in East Lansing and said, I remember these things, and you put some quarters in and found myself returning. And it was another rabbit hole that I dove down deep, and I'm still fascinated by pinball. So I love it. It's such a rich hobby. You can appreciate it for the gameplay, for the artwork, for the mechanics, for the electronics, for the history of it. There's just so many aspects of it to enjoy. I feel like it's a limitless area of research for me. And you can tell by my most recent work that I'm doing just that.
Okay, so you redesigned that whole game area. How many machines do you have right now?
Oh, there's a few down there.
I'm not asking you to tell me how much you spend. You don't have to let your wife know that, but
we've probably got about a dozen games down there, and it looks like a fancy man's room, but really, there are games down there that I've got for $5. There's games down there that I've got for free. There's games that I've got for more than that, but it's a surprisingly accessible hobby if you can find machines that are not working and fix them up, which is exactly what I've done with a few of those machines down there. So it's a wonderfully rich hobby that I'm really happy to have in my life.
Afterwards, you and I feel you and I are going to be BFFs going forward in life. So I'm just going to warn you about that, because you're going to educate me on pinball. So I've got another question. Yeah. Coin Op Carnival, second issue. Is there going to be? When can we expect it?
Yes, there is. So Coin Op Carnival is going to be a 4-issue limited series. The first one came out in 2019 and took us about 2.5 years to produce. We were hoping for an every other year release, which would put the next issue at 2021. That is not going to happen. Pandemic threw a monkey wrench into life for both Nick and I. So issue number 2 is coming, but it will not come this year. We're hoping for 2022, but we'll see how it goes. But more issues are coming until we produce all 4 of them.
Oh, and I'm going to confirm that because Nick is on the chat right now.
Hey, Nick.
And let me just see. He has said you found many ways to make your hobbies and interests interact with your professional work. Do you have any hints on ways that students might funnel those creative energies towards their own personal stuff? So what kind of? You kind of started talking about it, but what else would you say? How to make that connection? Because sometimes you get stuck in the corporate world. How to do what the man wants or the woman wants, and so how do you bring that personal interest into it, make it successful?
Yeah, that's really kind of what I base the ending of my talk around, is trying to recognize what it is that makes you happy. Pinball makes me happy. Neon makes me happy. Watches make me happy. They don't make everyone happy, but what makes you happy? What would be an interesting venue for you to explore? And do your best to move your work toward that, and you'll be a happy person. Like I said, I've done client work that I don't want to paint this completely rosy picture, because I know that we are in a time where many of us need to take the kind of work that we can get. So I don't want to discount that. But as soon as you're able, and as often as you're able, I would say move toward interests that are close to you, that are personal to you, that make you happy, and do work in that vein. Everybody needs artwork. Everybody needs illustration or work for hire. And so start targeting those locations, and that will snowball into people knowing you as oh, that guy's the pinball artist, or that guy's the neon designer. And hey, I love being known as that. And you'll be loved, or you'll love for being known as your passion designer too.
Well, and I love that you didn't wait for an opportunity, especially like with the watch, right? You solicited them. You said, "Hey, I would like to do this." You know what? They could have never responded, but they did. And I
Yeah.
think that's amazing. I think that's a good lesson for everybody. So I have a question for you as the professor. How do you balance critique and the need to grade with the desire to encourage and inspire your students?
That's a fine question.
You're getting it.
So I try to start the semester with a very welcoming tone. You know, I even have worked into my syllabus, welcoming people to share pronouns if they wish. I really try to make it a space that is welcoming and known to all as being a safe space first and foremost. So that starts on the first day of class. Then when we get to critiques, I try my best to have people talk about what is working well in the piece, and also what might need to be changed or what could use improvement, so that we're not just hearing, or the student interprets this as bad, you're not doing anything, but hey, these things are resonating with me, do more of that, or this didn't quite land, or it's kind of confusing as to what you're trying to get across with this. Maybe something else might work, giving suggestions on what alternate thing might help that piece. And then that usually sparks a conversation with students too, having ideas for how to better convey that particular message. So I hope that helps.
It does. It's a balancing act. It really is. So,
Completely.
So have you ever been approached by anyone to create a custom translate artwork, or have you ever thought about designing a pinball art package for a custom machine?
Is that Nick also?
This is sports and geekery.
Okay.
So it could be an opportunity.
All right. You never know. Funny thing, I just backed a Kickstarter campaign for a documentary about the Tetris championships. And every time I back a Kickstarter campaign, I always write the person and say, hey, I love this project. And I include a list of my professorships and comic stuff at the end. That backing of that campaign turned into me getting hired to illustrate one of their reward tiers. So I never know what's going to happen. But anyway, to answer this question about backglass design, yes, that has definitely crossed my mind. In fact, I have a pinball machine of my own that I would like to retheme. So that means creating the artwork for the backglass, the playfield, the plastic set, the cabinet artwork. But as you probably can tell from this talk, I've got a few irons in the fire. So I think that will probably be a project for retirement.
You say that now, but
absolutely love to do that.
One more question I have, because I know you have to get a class that you need to get to. But when you were working on the watch and you were working with such a small space, how much detail did you lose in the scaling process? Was there any?
I was really concerned about that as I was designing it. I'm used to drawing about a third bigger. And when I was drawing for the watch, I was drawing about 400% bigger, reduced down to about 37 millimeters on the wrist. And I was really worried about how much detail would be retained from the print. But Mr. Jones Watches uses a process called pad printing. And it's it's almost like a pillow, and it goes over and it picks up the ink and then it bonks down on the surface of the dial. And pad printing is, how do you describe it? I guess it's sort of akin to screen printing in the fact that you're laying down these opaque colors on top of one another. But unlike screen printing, where you have this mesh of wires or silk rather, and there's a finite level of detail you can get, with pad printing, there's still a finite level of detail, but you can get a much finer line with pad printing than you can with screen printing. So it held up beautifully. You saw that super zoom of my watch. That's 37 millimeters. That's this thing on my wrist right here, blown up to screen size, and the fidelity of line was incredible. So once I got that first prototype sent to me, I was like, whew, wow, my worries are gone now. I'm ready to keep going.
How about this? And this comes from Nick again. You've mentioned that you love process. Do you have any interest in stepping outside your process, changing your process, or working with new mediums such as paint or sculpture?
Yes, I do have a heavy interest in process, and my process that I outlined in this lecture is largely due to me looking at other people's process and sort of aping little bits and pieces here and there of how other people do it and using what works for me. As far as venturing out into completely different media like painting or sculpture, I do not have any immediate plans to do that. I have had the occasional thought of, wouldn't it be interesting to have one of my pieces made into a sculpture? Or maybe it would be interesting to paint one of my covers. I've done some watercolor work, and I don't know, I just don't feel proficient enough at any of that to put on a cover or put it into material yet. So yes, I am interested in different processes and what I can translate my work into, but yeah, kind of working with what I got right now, I suppose.
Well, I think you're working with quite a bit. As your father said, you are an influencer, Ryan Claytor. I hope you realize that, not just as a professor, but in everything that you do. So thank you so much for being here on Art Talk today, and sharing your story, sharing your insights with students, with our public. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you so much. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I really sincerely appreciate you having me on here. It's great to see you again. And
always good to see you.
Let me know when you need some help with your first and pinball machine of your collection.
You're going to get sick of me really fast. So I want to thank Jeff McHale, who is running the technical side of this from our media services department at Mott Community College. Thank you, Jeff, for everything today. Thank all of you for joining us. And I would like to also thank the Ballinger Trust for helping make these talks possible. We hope to see you all back here in February when another person from MSU and a former student of ours, Rebecca Casement, will be joining us to do a talk on February 16th at 1 p.m. You'll be able to find this link to the live stream at mcc.edu, our Fine Arts Gallery. So go ahead and check that out. And we hope to see you back here. And Ryan, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks again, Jim.
All right. Bye, everybody.